conference this morning. My name is Christian Brodie, and I am the chair of the Southeast Local Enterprise Partnership, SELOE. Thank you for all of you attending, and we're looking forward to a really great session. Just a few points on housekeeping to begin with. If all attendees could please turn off cameras and remain on mute, this will allow us to focus on the fantastic speakers that we have today. The meeting is being recorded, and it is an open and public meeting. And the video will be available on the SELOE website post-event. Anyone with questions throughout the session can submit them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer them this morning. If we're unable to answer them, we will provide an answer following the meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you a question, to a poll, and see if we can get a view from the audience that we have in the virtual room today. So if I could encourage you to answer the poll question that's on your screens right now. Are you committed to doing more to contribute to the clean growth agenda? So if you could vote now and then submit, that would be great, and we'll see how engaged we are, just to test you all the first thing. And hopefully we'll get an answer to that question, what you think, pretty soon. Well, it looks like we're all very committed to clean growth, which is encouraging. And I don't see anyone disagreeing, but some people are somewhat. So there are one or two people who are yet to be persuaded that we will have to do more. So that's great. Thank you for that. So as the economy starts its recovery from the pandemic, our focus must undoubtedly turn towards clean growth and ensuring that we are doing all that we can to combat climate change. In the Southeast, our efforts on climate change will affect our coast, our ports, our rural areas, and key sectors that are working hard to enact changes. We hope to explore this more today. The LEP's recent economic recovery and renewal strategy emphasizes clean growth. That is a guiding principle to supporting our commitment to rebuilding the economy. One of SELOE's 7 objectives is to put clean growth and climate change at the heart of what we do. The aim of this event today is to share insights, learn and consider the role we can play in the public and private sector to support the transition to net zero. We all have a role to play in meeting the UK's net zero targets, and we must embrace the opportunity we have at this time to shape our economic recovery and pursue future growth in a sustainable and considered way. We have secured excellent speakers for this conference today who can help us all to understand why clean growth is important for successful businesses in the future and for our partnerships like ours. This will provide us all with the opportunity to consider how we can act in the year ahead to support this important agenda. We want to offer as much opportunity for questions later as we can, so you can upload questions into the chat from now on, so please do so. I'm especially pleased to introduce Sir Jonathan Porritt. As a writer and broadcaster, he is one of Europe's most influential thought leaders on sustainable development. He is well known for his previous roles as chairman of the UK Sustainable Development Commission for 9 years, and of course as director of Friends of the Earth. He has published numerous books on this important issue. He is a co-founder of Forum for the Future, which helps companies to understand and promote sustainable development. And we look forward very much to hearing his perspective today. Welcome, Jonathan. Over to you.
Christian, thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to join you this morning. Obviously a very timely moment to be thinking about these things, what with everything going on in Glasgow at the moment, and a huge kind of national focus on what clean growth and low carbon prosperity really looks like and what it means. So it's great to be able to share this session this morning. So what I just want to try and do, if I may, is to link some of the issues that could be really significant for your LEP in the Southeast with what's happening in Glasgow and with the whole story about the climate emergency, which will be a bit of a stretch in just 20 minutes, but we'll give it a crack. I don't know how you're all responding to what's happening in Glasgow. It's an interesting experience for me, I must say, having actually been in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was actually signed into being. And here we are nearly 30 years later with pretty much the same sort of analysis being brought to bear on what we need to do. And yes, wonderful rhetorical commitments about what it is that we need to bring forward right now, but still some question marks about what that actually amounts to in practice. And the only way I can think about this and try and make sense of it is I see it as a kind of advanced form of cognitive dissonance. And you probably all know that cognitive dissonance is when an individual or an organization is trying to hold two conflicting realities in the same bit of their brain in order to deal with both of those things, because they're both equally important. And psychologists will tell you that cognitive dissonance requires a very direct form of intervention so as to resolve this cognitive dissonance. So a little moment from yesterday, for instance, just from Glasgow, which is a classic. So there was a big meeting on the side. Today is the finance day, okay? So everybody's talking about money today. And there was a kind of warm-up meeting for the finance day yesterday, at which the key speaker was no less than Larry Fink being the chief executive of BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, and certainly someone who's made a name for himself by talking a lot about the importance of addressing today's climate issues. His speech was apparently going extremely well until that point where he urged delegates in Glasgow to acknowledge that it's still going to be necessary to continue to invest in fossil fuels for a very significant period of time. At which point there was a collective groan all around the audience at that stage. BlackRock still has something like $12 billion invested in coal, which of course the whole of COP26 is trying to persuade people to get out of as fast as possible, and about another $60–70 billion invested in oil and gas, roughly $100 billion in the fossil fuels that are causing the core problem. Classic cognitive dissonance. And then later that afternoon, there was a big protest from a lot of the campaigners, including Greta Thunberg and others, which was focusing on Cambo. And Cambo, as you may know, is a potentially huge new investment for Shell in the North Sea, which the government at the moment has indicated that it is minded to approve. And again, protesters were pointing out, but how does this fit with the recommended urgent transition away from fossil fuels? Institutionalized cognitive dissonance. And it obviously holds us back because we still have a foot in both camps. We have a foot in the old fossil fuel economy, and many people's jobs are still dependent on that fuel, on that old economy. And increasingly now, we're seeking to get ourselves more and more into the new economy, in which there is no dependence on fossil fuels whatsoever. And just in case you think Larry Fink is more of a genius than he really is, he doesn't quite get it. We're transitioning out of fossil fuels entirely as fast as we possibly can. That's what the transition actually looks like, not Larry Fink's rather messy. We can go on making some good profits in the meantime, whilst we bring forward new investments in renewables, et cetera, et cetera. So there are only 3 bits of advice I'd like to offer for the LEP today, because I think it is really important to be practical about this. The first is that it's not a question of a bit of this and a bit of that. We'll have some good stuff from the old world and some increasingly interesting, if a bit niche stuff from the new world. That is not the nature of a LEP's responsibilities these days. The principal responsibility is to enable people to move as fast as possible out of that old world into this new world and transition from that old world to this new world in such a way that prosperity is secured and clean growth enables new jobs to prosper, communities to prosper, and so on. And we have to do that at speed. And I do want to emphasize that business about speed. You probably heard some of the discussions going on in Glasgow over the last couple of days, where a lot of commentators, particularly on the BBC, were saying, we hear all this stuff about needing to restrict average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And then we hear more stuff about restricting average temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. What difference can it possibly make? 0.5 of a degree centigrade? What's the big deal? Why don't we just go for 2 anyway, since it's obviously going to be more pragmatic and realistic, and that will mean Larry Fink can go on investing in his hydrocarbons for as long as he likes. Why don't we just settle for 2 instead of all this increasingly frenzied notion of keep 1.5 alive? Well, that's where something like COP is so important, because it is made up of scientists and politicians and business leaders. And the scientists are there to remind the politicians and sometimes the business leaders, although actually they're usually better informed than the politicians. The scientists are there to remind people the difference between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade could be the difference between a sustainable, stable future for humankind and no sustainable, stable future for humankind. It's as stark as that. And that is because, as the scientists will explain, although it may not sound like very much, the difference between 1.5 and 2, from a systems perspective, looking at all of these very complicated, huge ecosystems on which life on Earth depends, the difference is absolutely massive. Just one example. If we can restrict the temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, there is still a reasonable chance that we will be able to avoid irreversible melting in the Greenland ice sheet. If we go to 2 degrees centigrade, those Arctic scientists tell us that it is then almost guaranteed that over time, the whole of the Greenland ice sheet will melt down. And there is a lot of ice in the Greenland ice sheet. In fact, there is the equivalent of something between 6 and 7 meters, not centimeters, meters of sea level rise. So if you're an Arctic scientist and a politician bowls up to you and says, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2? The obvious answer is the difference between a future for humankind or not. That's just one ecosystem, one set of tipping points. I could explain so many others. There are 7 or 8 major global tipping points of that kind, all of which we have to attend to. So it was interesting when Christian, in his introduction, referred specifically to the coastal areas of the LEP and the ports and the prosperity that comes from all of that. Well, here's the reality. At the moment, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is predicting that there will be no less than 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of this century, and a very real possibility that there will be 2 meters of sea level rise by the end of this century. That's now. That's with just 1.1 degrees of warming since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So then you need to extrapolate from 1.1, what it looks like today, where we're seeing average sea levels rise by around 4 millimeters a year, through to 2050, through to the end of the century, when we might obviously have something very, very different to contemplate. So speed is critical. These impacts are real now. Very interesting report published today saying that if you look at it from a European perspective, the floods in Germany and the incredible heat wave this summer in southern European countries are all definitively now caused by climate change. There's no other possibility of explaining those extremes. So that's the first thing, is move fast. Do not put this off to some distant date. All of these changes we need to make need to be made fast. The second thing, and maybe this is a bit contradictory, but I hope you'll bear with me on this, don't get lost in the big picture. Okay, the big picture is big and it's scary. And sometimes I look at that and I think to myself, oh God, how do we ever get up every morning and get on with what we need to do? So don't get lost in the big picture. Focus on what we can do now. Focus in particular on the basics. And I just want to emphasize that because right now there's a huge amount of hype about what I call not the basics. So there's a ton of hype around hydrogen, for instance. Forget it. Forget it. Hydrogen isn't going to make any real difference to the kind of prosperity we're looking for in the Southeast for a long time to come. And if it's going to be green hydrogen, and any other kind of hydrogen, by the way, is a total waste of time from a climate perspective, including blue hydrogen. If it's going to be green hydrogen, supplies of green hydrogen are going to be few and far between for at least the next decade. And it'll be very expensive. It takes a ton of renewable electricity to produce green hydrogen. So don't get caught up in this kind of urge to hype things up, which are just on the drawing board. Stick to the basics. And the basics are these: efficiency first. You never hear people say that. However excited we get about renewables and other forms of technology breakthrough, everything depends on efficiency. It doesn't matter whether the electron or the unit of energy that you're using comes from old energy sources, hydrocarbon-based sources, or new energy sources from renewable electricity, for instance, or biomethane, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter. If the asset that you're using that energy in is still hopelessly inefficient, then we are just wasting our time. So efficiency first. Hardly anybody does that in the way that we should. Then for sure, we've got tons of opportunities to make sense of renewable electricity, in particular in the Southeast, on solar energy. Now, you hear a lot about that these days. You may not appreciate that the cost advantage for solar continues to improve year on year. Lazard's, the big investment bank, yesterday produced its annual report on what it calls the levelized cost of energy. That's the comparison between different kinds of generation in different contexts. And solar is already out-competing almost all other sources of electricity generation. And the gap between solar and anything else continues to improve every year. I was reminded when I came to write Hope in Health that it's only 7 years ago that the government's own chief scientific advisor in the department, which is now called BEIS, described the idea that ours would be a renewable electricity economy as an appalling delusion. An appalling delusion. Well, trust me, ours is going to be a renewable energy revolution. We are already seeing that. So in the Southeast, fantastic opportunities for solar of every kind: roof-mounted, ground-mounted, floating solar. And I'm hoping that you have an opportunity to talk to your water companies in the region about the advantages now of floating solar power, which are beginning to be taken up all over the place because it really is a very effective extension of the solar technology. Costs come down every single year. Forget feed-in tariffs. You don't need feed-in tariffs any longer. These are investment propositions that pay back for themselves. And because of technology progress, a huge number of industrial roofscapes, distribution centers, retail centers, factories, because of the light weighting of new solar installations, the scope for rolling out solar on our existing infrastructure, business infrastructure, if you like, is enormous. Now, I can absolutely guarantee in a lot of the local authorities that will make up the LEP, you're going to have a lot of naysayers. You're going to have a lot of people who in the past said, oh, all that solar stuff, it's just a niche. It's never going to make any difference. Please do not allow those people now to get in the way of what is an unstoppable revolution, an unstoppable revolution. We've had enough of the naysayers. They've done us a lot of damage, frankly. And now we have to move at speed with a degree of purpose that hasn't happened before. And the third technology, of course, is EVs, electric vehicles. You've seen the government's very clear guidance on this. It won't be possible to purchase petrol or diesel vehicles in the UK after 2030. Absolute clarity from the government on this. Doing quite a bit, needs to do a bit more around charging infrastructure and the whole standardization of what charging infrastructure looks like. But the direction of travel, if I can use that phrase, is completely clear. So how quickly are we going to be able to move public and private sector into a state where, for instance, all commercial fleets move to all EVs within the course of the next 2 years? Commercially, completely viable right now. What's the blockage? Just not enough people doing the procurement in the way that they ought to be doing it. Efficiency, renewables, mostly solar, EVs. I say mostly solar because it's still a bit of a nightmare getting planning permission for onshore wind, which we actually need a lot more of, but I won't go there today because of planning confusion, as it were. And thirdly, if I may, all of this needs de-risking. One of the benefits of a LEP, by virtue of bringing private sector and public sector together, is the opportunity to de-risk what will in effect be huge flows of new investment into creating the clean growth of the future. We're talking obviously billions and billions of pounds of new investment coming forward to make this revolution actually happen on the ground. So from a financial perspective, which will be the focus of everybody's attention up in Glasgow today, from a financial perspective, that needs to be de-risked. And a lot of creativity needs to be brought to bear to bring forward new funding mechanisms to help expedite this transition, including, I hope, the increased opportunities to use municipal bonds, not something that is particularly well understood here in the UK. Treasury has had a pretty dead hand when it came to enabling, facilitating the use of more locally generated sources of capital. But now we're beginning to see local authorities, with often very active partnerships with the private sector, bring forward local bonds, municipal bonds, to drive these investments. For instance, solar panels on schools. Why have we not done that on every single school across the whole of the UK? And obviously, you need to think then about the financing side. So we need some pretty smart people working really collaboratively to bring forward those opportunities. So that's it really. Clarity about the direction of travel. Don't get caught up with a bit of this and a bit of that. Don't get lost in the big picture. Do the basics, efficiency, solar, EVs. And thirdly, focus on this story about finance and the de-risking side of things. I was pleased to see when I was wrapping my head around what the Southeast LEP is doing, this partnership that you have with a couple of other LEPs in the region, and that you're now able to start talking about partnership between different LEPs. And that could be extremely significant when it comes, for instance, to shared procurement and using the muscle, given that LEPs haven't exactly been, how can I put this, generously funded by government, using what muscle you've got to help create conditions for increased collaboration. So, Christian, I'll leave it there. I know we have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end.
We'll do it at the end of the speakers session, if you don't mind, Jonathan. But thank you so much. That was extremely interesting, thought-provoking, and some very interesting advice for us. I know that your words will inspire us all to think about how we can ensure this issue is at the forefront of our minds. I was particularly interested in your views on hydrogen, which has a number of people have been really pushing in our area in particular. So that was extremely interesting. So thank you for that. So we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who will be coming to us via video. He is Andrew Griffith MP, who has been appointed the UK's Net Zero Business Champion. He has the role of engaging small and medium-sized enterprises on behalf of government, and of supporting the country's business community to make credible plans to achieve net zero by 2050 or earlier. So we'll now play the video, I hope.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to have the chance to speak with you today. Thank you so much to colleagues at the South East LEP for organising this fantastic event. I'm absolutely delighted to see so many businesses of all sizes putting sustainability front and centre. Not just those taking small first steps on their net zero journey, but generating some very ambitious net zero targets and bringing their peers along with them. I'm proud to say that CELEP has an incredible track record in funding a wide range of innovative, sustainable projects to help businesses reduce their emissions. Just some of those I was reading about were Low Carbon Southeast, LOCASE, which is directly supporting businesses to decarbonise their activity and provides matched funding to private sector investment to implement those changes. LOCASE has helped a grand total of 1,300 SMEs across the region. It's been so successful, it's now expanding into Coast to Capital, Enterprise M3 and the Solent LEP areas. Brilliantly named Riding Sunbeams Solar Railways, which secured almost 3 million Getting Building Fund for a project which will build and connect the world's first megawatt scale community renewable solar energy plant directly powering the current railway located in the heart of East Sussex, and Green Hydrogen Energy Facility, where CELEP secured over £3 million from the Getting Building Fund for this project, which involves the installation of the UK's largest zero carbon hydrogen production system near Herne Bay in Kent. And as if that wasn't enough to secure their place on the net zero league table, CELEP recently sponsored the Planet Mark Zero Carbon Bus Tour flagship event in Canterbury at the University of Kent in September. I saw that bus. It was very exciting, in collaboration with Kent County Council and the university. And that visit resulted in over 60 businesses attending and being engaged with Planet Mark, and they're now on their way to making the net zero pledge. The actions of every single business will be central to the country's successful transition to a low carbon economy. It's going to drive jobs and growth within the UK, but also open up large and attractive new sectors of the world economy in which businesses who are based in the UK can take significant market shares. I was delighted to be appointed by the Prime Minister as the UK Net Zero Business Champion, because it gives me the opportunity to speak to so many British businesses, large and small, and to hear about the tremendous steps that they're already taking towards a net zero world. Following the incredibly difficult challenges of the last 18 months, and recognising that for many businesses we're not yet out of the woods on that, we now have a clear opportunity to drive a green recovery. In the year, almost the month, that the UK is both the G7 president and we host the COP26 Climate Summit in November, we have a historic opportunity to build a crescendo of momentum to make real and lasting change happen. The government, for its part, has demonstrated global leadership by baking a 2050 net zero target into law. That's the very highest form of commitment any government can make. As part of our contribution to the Paris Agreement, our nationally determined contribution, we've committed to reduce our emissions by at least 68% by 2030. If you think about the scale of that reduction, it's genuinely amazing. For over 2,000 years, man has used carbon as our primary energy source, and now, in a handful of decades, we plan to revolutionise that. I'd love to be able to demonstrate the same degree of ambition amongst our businesses and investors, and I think that we can. So my asks to you today, how you can be part of the UK green business revolution, is to take some practical actions. And there's three key things that I think all of us can do. First, if you haven't already, please sign up to the Race to Zero campaign. You can find all the details by visiting the new UK Business Climate Hub at businessclimatehub.org/UK. In a space that's often riven by complicated and competing environmental standards, this is the kite mark that we would like all businesses to adopt. And you can have the confidence that it's supported by the United Nations, by the UK government, and it's underpinned by science-based targets. As businesses, you know the power of a cut-through brand, and our UK-wide Together for Our Planet campaign is our own domestic brand in this global Race to Zero campaign. You can proudly display that on your digital channels, and signing up will give you access to a range of material and branding. Customers are increasingly looking for sustainable products and services, so demonstrating you're taking action as part of a UN-backed initiative is a great way to gain a competitive advantage. So that's the first step. The second is to tell your supply chain, to show them what you're doing and what they can do. We're all each other's keeper on the climate agenda. Each of us are someone's customer or supplier. And if we all move together at the same time, the costs of making the change are transformationally lower, and we can move much, much faster. And then thirdly, please tell everyone, especially me, so that we can champion what you're doing. My experience talking to businesses every single day is there's a huge appetite to make this change. And most of you here today will want to make a difference. But the biggest barrier is the knowing what to do. Now, hearing what others have done, case studies, and then giving people the confidence to do the same is absolutely priceless. So I conclude, we have a huge task ahead of us, but also a really huge opportunity. As COP26 draws ever closer by the day, I thank all of you for everything you're already doing. I look forward to hearing more about what you're going to do in the future, and let's all seize this moment. It really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Thank you all.
So thank you very much to Andrew Griffith. There's some real challenges. Some real challenges have been set for us by him, and it also gives us a real understanding of the issue of the government's commitment. And I'm sure we'll be seeing more about this during COP26 over the next few weeks. Unfortunately, due to COP26, Andrew cannot be with us today to answer our questions, but if anyone would like to know anything specific, please submit your queries and we will seek answers following the conference. I'm now going to hand over to our next speaker, Jonathan Withy from Planet Mark, which is Planet Mark is a sustainability certification program. It offers a way for companies to commit to driving progress towards net zero and gives practical information and advice to help companies to get them started on this journey. Jonathan, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really awesome to be here. I'm just going to switch over to sharing my screen. Hopefully that's worked okay. And you know, it's a real an honor to be speaking with especially Jonathan Porritt, who, you know, he's a pioneer of the climate agenda. He's been doing this thing since the 1980s, and really grateful for all the amazing work that he's done. And really, like, I've got some slides here because I don't think I can speak quite as eloquently as him for a prolonged period of time on these subjects. But what I want to do is focus on that practical that we've heard Jonathan speak about, and Andrew Griffith there, and an emphasis on let's get the basics right. So I'm going to be talking about, you know, what does net zero actually mean? Because there's a bit, you know, there's all these different carbon phrases and related words out there, and so we're going to demystify that a little bit, and then talk about those practical steps that businesses in particular and in the Southeast can take in order to to start to radically decarbonize their organization. But also, you know, what are the business benefits to this thing? So, you know, why net zero carbon now? We need action, as Jonathan was talking about, but there's actually a really beautiful set of drivers as to why businesses in particular and other organizations should be getting on this journey and starting to measure and reduce their carbon footprint in line with targets. You know, you've got the stick element, you know, the regulation that's coming through. Even, you know, today with COP, you know, with the focus on financial institutions producing net zero plans and listed companies producing net zero plans by next year, which are going to be audited and checked, all really positive. You know, you've got the general awareness in society of the issue of the climate crisis. I don't think, you know, talking generally what's on TV, right? The One Show, for example, they're talking about COP every day this week. You know, it's headline news, everyone's aware of it, and you know, people are, you know, climate anxiety is a real thing. I talk to business leaders all the time, and they're saying to me, you know, over the last few years, their kids are coming home from school, learning about this, and they're really worried. And this is on our, you know, this is on our watch. So we need to do more. And then from a commercial imperative, fundamentally, people want to work for companies that are doing more good, and companies want to work with other companies that are doing more good. And if you can credibly demonstrate that, and how you're playing an active role in walking the talk, it's going to help you win and retain business. That's just fundamentally what's happening in the market right now, which is really exciting. So there's a massive opportunity to differentiate yourself from the market by credibly demonstrating you're measuring and reducing carbon. So specifically on what we mean by net zero, start with a carbon footprint itself, right? What is the carbon impacts of an organization? And it's broken down into different scopes. So this is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most widely used framework for measuring carbon in the world. And we break it down into 3 scopes. Companies have to measure what we call your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 1 being your direct fuel consumption. So that's fuel you're putting into to use to heat and cool your buildings. And that's also fuel that you're putting into company owned or leased vehicles. You have to measure that. And then scope 2, predominantly for most organizations, is electricity consumption. If you're manufacturing on an industrial base, there's a bit of steam in there, but fundamentally it's electricity consumption. So we have to measure the carbon associated with those activities. And then we got scope 3, which is the frontier of carbon footprinting, in which is everything else. So it's all of your indirect carbon impacts that you're having, through your different related business activities. Now there's 15 categories here. Some are easier to measure than others. Easy to measure categories that are material to your organization, so probably significant, would be things like business travel, commuting, waste. There's a bit of water in there. They're relatively easy things to measure that you should have data, readily available data, in order to measure that. Harder things to measure are things like purchase goods and services, which is category 1, which again is what companies are grappling with. Every company's grappling with that at the moment. Every company has a supply chain, you know, 50 to 100 suppliers, say, and trying to measure the carbon associated with those activities that you're procuring to run your business, from everything from marketing service to stationery, has a carbon footprint associated with it. And then we break this down into upstream and downstream activities. So this is what a carbon footprint looks like. And we have to measure scope 1 and scope 2, and we have to try and measure as much of our scope 3 emissions as possible that are material, so they are significant to your organization. So not every organization has a franchise, for example, which is category 14. Not every organization has separate investments. So, you know, what's relevant material to organizations? We have to measure all those things. And then if we break that down into actually what the definition for net zero is, so the official net zero standard was published last week by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Really cool document, some great things in there. I'm going to talk to you about that, plus what best practice looks like. So best practice for achieving net zero is exactly this. Reducing your getting your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions to absolute zero. That is critical. And I'll talk to you about practical things in order to get there as possible. So that has to be true zero, your scope 1 and scope 2, direct fuel consumption, electricity. The indirect emissions, which is scope 3, we have to get that as close to zero as we possibly can, at least 90%. Now, the science-based targets net zero standard is talking about 67%, but 90% is best practice. And then you can offset those emissions through carbon removal schemes, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. Here's some practical steps, things that to be focused on, as Jonathan Porritt was saying. Energy efficiency, it's not very sexy compared to other, like all these awesome technologies that are coming out, but fundamentally we need to get that right. So energy efficiency, switching to EVs, renewable energy, scope 3, supplier engagement and collaboration, waste reduction practices, and things like travel hierarchies are quite cool. And I'm going to talk about offsetting in a second. So definition for net zero: scope 1 and scope 2 have to be absolute zero. Scope 3, measure it, reduce it by 90%, offset the residual 10% through carbon removal schemes. And we can see here a beautifully animated diagram which shows that. It normally flows a bit better than that, but we can see here over the next 10 years, over the next 5 years, we've got to really cut our carbon significantly predominantly addressing low-hanging fruit, electrifying, energy efficiency, and electrifying everything, and that electricity comes from renewable sources. And then we can see it gets harder, and there will be always about 10%, and you can offset that residual emissions. Now, offsetting itself, talk very briefly. I'm talking quite fast because I've actually got quite a lot to get through within this short space of time. We're getting there though. Carbon offsets, cowboy industry, right? A little bit. The demand for offsetting has at least doubled in the last year, which is a good thing. But in order to ensure your offsets do what they say on the tin, gold standard or verified carbon standard offsets, VCS offsets, they're the best, most credible, and provide most assurances that your money investing in offsets is actually going towards those projects on the ground, and as much of it as possible. And then there's two types of offsetting schemes. There's carbon avoidance offsets, which are technologies that replace activities that would normally cause carbon to be emitted into the atmosphere. They're things like solar PV investments, onshore renewables, clean cook stoves. Then there's carbon removal offsets, of which there's two types. There's natural carbon sequestration sinks, or there's carbon capture and storage technologies. Natural carbon sinks, afforestation, peatland restoration, seagrass projects, very cool, very popular. And then carbon capture and storage technology, very much in its infancy. The largest one has just been built off in Iceland, I believe, and that is, it's sequestering some carbon from the atmosphere, but not enough. And the issue is, can we scale that technology in the time frame that we need? That's very much up for debate, and the consensus is probably not. So we need to rely on natural carbon sinks as much as we can, and there's great announcements yesterday around the end to deforestation by 2030. Right, measuring your carbon footprint. This is a Planet Mark report. You can't manage what you don't measure is something I'll talk about very shortly.
Jonathan, just to remind you, we have only a couple of minutes, so if you could
yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No worries, Chris. You can't manage what you don't measure. This is and having a clean carbon footprint report allows you to see where your significant impacts take place in order to focus in your energies. Setting a credible net zero target. Every organization has to get to net zero by 2050 in the UK. It's law. Measure those scope 1 and scope 2 and material scope 3 scopes. Set your baseline year no less than 2 years ago if you haven't already. And science-based targets, rule of thumb, you have to reduce your emissions by at least 50% by 2030. Many companies have interpreted this in different ways. Here's some examples. I can share these slides afterwards for people to have a look at in more detail. Very cool and really interesting, but it shows you that people are interpreting this thing in different ways, but we need a bit more consistency. Third step, how to get there. This is the Planet Mark approach. Measure and independently verify, set targets in place to reduce annually. Engage really effectively and meaningfully with your teams. People are really passionate about this stuff. You need to upskill your teams internally. Collaboration with suppliers is really important. Share your achievements externally, good and bad, so people can learn from it. And collaboration with your clients, they want to help, they want your help to help them achieve net zero as well. 3 decarbonisation pillars: use less energy, redesign for zero carbon, which I can talk more about in more detail afterwards with anyone who wants to talk about it, and then decarbonise your electricity supply. Green electricity is more competitive than brown, especially with the rising energy prices and the rise of gas. So get on a renewable energy tariff, really simple. Communicate what you're doing at a glance. This is different ways we help companies communicate. And then finally, we've had our zero carbon tour, which Andrew Griffiths very kindly pointed out. We had an event in Canterbury, which was amazing. We've been traveling the country, collecting zero carbon stories, helping people understand what net zero is and the difference between that and carbon neutrality. And we want to help organizations set credible net zero targets. Here's a beautiful map of the UK of all of our stops and different Planet Mark certified organizations. We have free net zero carbon workshops running one tomorrow, and then you can see them there. Again, I can share details with that afterwards. And as Andrew Griffith said, UN-backed Race to Zero, this is a really nice way to credibly demonstrate that you're taking the first steps to net zero. Make a pledge, plan, proceed, publish, talk about it. It's really cool. And leave you with this, Sir David quote, who we use a lot. He hasn't quite given us official permission yet, but I think he'll be okay. So this is a crucial moment in our history. This could be a year for positive change for ourselves, for our planet, and for the wonderful creatures with which we share it. A year to the world can remember and proudly say we made a difference. This is on our watch, and it's time to take action. Chris, I hope that was okay. Ran over 1 minute.
Absolutely perfect, Jonathan.
I'll stop sharing.
I did better myself, so you've done great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a couple of questions for Sir Jonathan, and then hopefully we'll get a couple of questions for you too. I've certainly got one that I would like to answer. So the first question for Sir Jonathan is, if you had the post-lunch slot to talk to leaders at the COP26, which would be the key message you would want to land with them?
Well, as we've all said in one way or another this morning, this transition has to be effected in a market-based economy. In a market-based economy, things work if the price that we pay for things reflects its true cost. So the one thing that world leaders could really do now is to move as fast as possible towards a cost of carbon across the whole of the global economy. That actually would be the single most effective way of giving people a sense of what a totally decarbonized global economy would look like.
Thank you. That's really interesting to put you on the spot there. And the second one, which actually has been asked by someone in the audience, but I'm actually also personally very interested in it myself, and that is that there are so many nations signing up to new targets, but the greatest polluters are not signing up to the 1.5 centigrade, but only to 2 degrees centigrade. So what do we do as a nation to compensate? And what can any of us do to compensate for that? If people are going at different paces, what do we do?
It's problematic. There's no question about that. People celebrated the fact that Prime Minister Modi had set a target for net zero carbon by 2070. That's so much too late. Nobody wanted to point this out, but nonetheless, that's exactly what the question is talking about here. That would definitely take us to 2 degrees centigrade and beyond. So the trick really, Christian, is that we have to acknowledge that in the rich world, we bear the brunt of the historical responsibility, the liability for the emissions that rich world countries have put into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So in essence, we are in the frame to do this heavy lifting now, early in the piece, between now and 2030. And the other thing to say about this is, which is really important, if we can demonstrate how this transition to a low carbon economy works and increases skills and jobs and prosperity and all the rest of it, and quality of life, cleaner air, the whole bit, then this will be hugely encouraging for countries that at the moment are still, if you like, coping with other economic priorities, dealing with poverty, etc. It will give them every encouragement that it's possible to move more rapidly than they're currently minded to do.
Thank you. And then the final question for you, it's probably the one that's very relevant to us here in the Southeast, and you mentioned wind, but also in the Southeast, we have one huge natural advantage for us, which is we have the second highest tidal fall and rise in the world. I mean, in some parts of the Southeast, we actually have 4 tides in 24 hours. So tide for us is a marvelous natural resource. Do you think we're doing enough to capture that? Do you think is there more that we can do? You've talked about solar, you've talked about wind, but tide for us in the Southeast in particular, given our geographic positioning, is something that we feel should be made more use of. What do you think about that?
Yes, no, I think you're right. I mean, I'm an enormously enthusiastic supporter of tidal energy and have been for a very long time. When I was chair of the Sustainable Development Commission, which you referred to, Christian, the commission produced a report on tidal energy, which was a little controversial, it has to be said, because we did recommend a tidal barrage across the Severn, which was difficult for a lot of environmentalists to stomach at the time. But the truth is now, these technologies have changed, opportunities have grown. We're thinking much more about tidal lagoons than about barrages now, which I think are really important. Yeah. There is a new sense of momentum building here. And it is really interesting when you hear government ministers talk about the need for energy security, for generating as much of the energy, particularly the electricity that we need from our own indigenous resources, as they're sometimes called, then tidal obviously has a fantastically important role to play.
Yeah.
So for me, we need to bring tidal back into the frame very quickly. I'm doing a little bit of work at the moment looking at what this would mean, particularly in the Severn estuary, what it would mean with North Wales, and what it would mean around the Liverpool area. Those are the 3 areas where there's a lot of existing feasibility work that has been done. I'm less familiar with the opportunities in the Southeast, Christian, but would be delighted to find out more about it, frankly.
Thames Estuary, I feel, is one. There's already, as you know, there's already a barrier, so there ought to be, which of man to be able to do something there. But it seems to me that there's a major gap that we should be looking at. So, Jonathan, thank you very much for your contributions and for your answers to these questions. I'm sure there'll be more that we may wish to submit to you, but thank you so much for your time. So,
thank you.
So Jonathan, again, there's a personal question for me to you, is that I chair a charitable foundation that clearly is an investor, and we're moving to sustainable and impact investing. That's something we're looking at very, very keenly. We're also obviously very interested in people's environmental records and how best we as investors engage. One of the things that frustrates us, certainly frustrates me, is there is no there's no sort of kite mark or no standard that is easy for people like myself as chair of a foundation to look at a company or indeed a fund of funds to see whether or not environmental policies are being engaged with by the company and there are clear targets and they're moving towards those targets. How do you respond to that, and what should we do as either as charities or endowments to encourage that? Should we be engaging with the Charity Commission? Should we be engaging with the FSA or the Bank of England? Who should we be talking to, and what can we do? And do you feel it's already there and I've just missed it?
No, it's definitely not already there and you've missed it. So different funds and the investment community, with the rise and to prominence of ESG, are playing a really active role in this, which is awesome. Fundamentally, it's awesome, right? And we're seeing announcements that are more announcements going to come out today. But each fund is taking a completely different approach to how they assess their investments, and how, in particular around net zero and carbon, how those organizations are measuring and actually reducing their impacts, but then also looking at things like adaptation and climate resilience, which is what the TCFD framework is trying to come in and help companies understand. What I would say is look at whether they've set a net zero target, but the most important thing is the strategy that sits behind that target. So looking at that and seeing what they're doing and their understanding of it, it's really important. And, you know, with my Planet Mark certification hat on, if those numbers are independently verified and certified by an organization, they're going to give it that much more credibility to demonstrate that that company's doing the right thing. But it is really, you know, new, especially to the investment community who are trying to make informed decisions based on a company's environmental credentials. It is quite new, and we need a bit of consistency around it, which will come for sure.
Thank you. And then the final question I wanted to ask you is that I'm guessing that there are a lot of SMEs that don't even know where to begin in terms of starting their journey to net zero. So what would your advice be to us at CELEP? What should we be doing to make sure that people know how to start, know how to get in contact with people like yourselves? What can we do to push this agenda more actively?
Yeah, so there are some amazing organizations out there that are helping upskill people to understand exactly what they can do to decarbonize and achieve net zero for their organization, whether it's the Carbon Literacy Project, whether it's our Net Zero Essentials workshops. It's a great foundation and starting point. And actually, there's such a great appetite for people, especially in the SMEs, to want to do more, but they're just not sure where to start. So helping inform them the exact practical steps, giving me the opportunity to talk about it today, is a great place to start. And measuring carbon is not that complex, and there's some great tools out there. There's free tools coming out as well. And yeah, and then talk about what you're doing with your external stakeholders that are important to you and understand what's important to them. Tesco have come out saying that every supplier within their supply chain has to have a net zero target and a plan to achieve it by next year as well. So there are all these different drivers for it, and lots of organizations out there now who can help with, especially helping SMEs understand what they need to do.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you once again to both of our two speakers and for your answers. There are lots of other questions that we haven't been able to in the time to get to, but if we may send them to you, and if you're able to, and then we'll put the responses on our website. So thank you both Jonathans for your contributions. Very inspiring, and of course, it's climate, net zero and climate is always topical, but right now it is clearly extremely topical with what's going on in Glasgow. So thank you very much once again. Before we move to our next section of the program, we want to make sure you're still all there and listening. So what I'd like to do is to answer the poll that's going to come up on your screen, and that is, what do you think will have the biggest impact on clean growth? Government policy, local action, individual action, international collaboration? So I could ask you just to take a minute or two just to answer that and submit. That would be great. So we're going to, okay. That's interesting. I'd just be interested, the two Jonathans, just to see how you react to that. So first to Jonathan Porritt, how do you respond to that? Do you agree, or do you think we've got it completely wrong? You're on mute, Jonathan. Jonathan, you're on mute. Oh, great. Still on mute.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute with the poll result on the screen.
Yeah, sure.
No problem, no problem. That doesn't surprise me, because it is critical that companies understand the framework in which they're being asked to deliver things. And when it talks about government action, that's not necessarily just increased regulation or anything else. It's the whole way in which the tone is set by government to enable this transition. And a lot of it will be enabling rather than simply higher standards. So I think that makes sense to me. I would have voted in that direction, that's for sure. But there are going to be many different opportunities for government to do this very creatively.
Thank you. And Jonathan Withey, your response, your reaction to that?
Yeah, no, all really relevant, and we need an emphasis from everyone, right? It's all hands to the pump now, and I think from a global perspective, from a government perspective, from a local authority perspective, to SMEs, to individuals, and that's what the tool really understood, that everyone across all different walks of life and business and industry are all doing so amazing things. So everyone has a collective, that's a bit, or maybe I've dodged the question a little bit there, but everyone has an active part to play in this thing. Great.
Okay, well, once more would like to take the opportunity to thank both Jonathans, Porritt and Withey, for being here today and to providing us with really insightful and helpful approaches to clean growth. and what this means, and putting it into a context for us. So thank you both very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks.
So now we're going to move on to a series of debate panels which will showcase current activity to secure clean growth in the Southeast and allow us to consider where some of the future opportunities lie for the region in this new economy. There are 4 panels across 2 sessions. So the first session you have the option to join is Clean Growth and Business. In what ways can firms be supported to clean growth and unlock new opportunities? And the second one is Clean Growth in a Global Gateway. How can the Southeast lead the shift to low carbon transport and trade? So if you could please choose your debate panel on the screen now, and you will automatically be routed to that breakout room. When the session has concluded, you will automatically be routed back to this main forum. So please choose now. And we'll see you back at 10:45.